Question 71. What territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? The Louisiana Territory, Louisiana. The Louisiana Territory was a large area west of the Mississippi River. It was 828,000 square miles. In 1803, the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. The Louisiana Purchase Treaty was signed in Paris on April 30th, 1803. It was the largest acquisition of land in American history. Farmers could now ship their farm products down the Mississippi River without permission from other countries. This was important because the city of New Orleans was a major shipping port. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States and expanded it westward. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led an expedition to map the Louisiana Territory. Question 72. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1800s. War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Civil War, Spanish-American War. The United States fought four major wars in the 1800s. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. The War of 1812 lasted from 1812 through 1815. President James Madison asked Congress to declare war on Great Britain. The British were stopping and seizing American ships. They were also arming American Indians to fight against the Americans. As a result of this war, the nation's trade was disrupted and the U.S. Capitol was burned. The Americans won the war. This was the first time after the Revolutionary War that America had to fight a foreign country to protect its independence. The Mexican-American War was a conflict between Mexico and America. The war began in Texas in 1846. President James Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor and his forces to occupy land claimed by both the United States and Mexico. President Polk believed westward expansion was important for the United States to grow. When Mexico attacked, the United States went to war with Mexico. When the war ended in February 1848, the United States and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This treaty gave Texas to the United States and extended the boundaries of the United States west to the Pacific Ocean. In the Civil War, the people of the United States fought against each other. Americans in the northern states fought to support the federal government, the Union, against Americans from the southern states. The southern states were trying to separate themselves to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy. The war lasted from 1861 to 1865, when the Confederate Army surrendered to the Union Army. Many lives were lost in the American Civil War. In 1898, the United States fought Spain in the Spanish-American War. The United States wanted to help Cuba become independent from Spain because the United States had economic interest in Cuba. The war began when a U.S. battleship was sunk near Cuba. Many Americans believed it was the Spanish who attacked the ship. For this reason, America went to war with Spain. By the end of 1898, the war was over with a victory for the United States. Cuba had its independence, and Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines became territories of the United States. Question 73. Name the U.S. war between the North and the South. The Civil War, the war between the states. The American Civil War is also known as the war between the states. It was a war between the people in the northern states and those in the southern states. The Civil War was fought in many places across the United States, but most battles were fought in the southern states. The first battle was at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The first major battle between the Northern Union Army and the Southern Confederate Army took place at Bull Run in Manassas, Virginia, in July 1861. The Union expected the war to end quickly. After its defeat at the Battle of Bull Run, the Union realized that the war would be long and difficult. In 1865, the Civil War ended with the capture of the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union Army at Appomattox Courthouse in central Virginia. Over the 4-year period, more than 3 million Americans fought in the Civil War, and more than 600,000 people died. Question 74. Name one problem that led to the Civil War. Slavery, economic reasons, states' rights. The Civil War began when 11 southern states voted to secede, separate from the United States to form their own country, the Confederate States of America. These southern states believed that the federal government of the United States threatened their right to make their own decisions. They wanted states' rights, with each state making their own decisions about their government. If the national government contradicted the state, they did not want to follow the national government. The North and South had very different economic systems. The South's agriculture-based economy depended heavily on slave labor. The southern states feared that the United States government would end slavery. The southern states believed that this would hurt their economic and political independence. The economy of the northern states was more industrial and did not depend on slavery. The northern states fought to keep all the United States together in the Union. They tried to stop the southern states from separating into a new Confederate nation. There were also many people in the North who wanted to end slavery. These differences led to the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 until 1865. Question 75. What was one important thing that Abraham Lincoln did? Freed the slaves, Emancipation Proclamation, saved or preserved the Union, led the United States during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was President of the United States from 1861 to 1865 and led the nation during the Civil War. Lincoln thought the separation of the South, Confederate states, was unconstitutional, and he wanted to preserve the Union. In 1863, during the Civil War, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that the slaves who lived in the rebelling Confederate states were forever free. Lincoln is also famous for his Gettysburg Address. He gave that speech at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in November 1863. Earlier that year, at the Battle of Gettysburg, the Northern Union Army had won a major battle to stop the Confederate Army from invading the North. To honor the many who died in this battle, the governor of Pennsylvania established the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg. Lincoln spoke at the dedication ceremony and praised those who fought and died in battle. He asked those still living to rededicate themselves to saving the Union so that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. On April 14, 1865, soon after taking office for his second term, Abraham Lincoln was killed by a Southern supporter, John Wilkes Booth, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Question 76. What did the Emancipation Proclamation do? Freed the slaves, freed slaves in the Confederacy, freed slaves in the Confederate States, freed slaves in most Southern states. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation declared that slaves living in the Southern or Confederate states were free. Many slaves joined the Union Army. In 1865, the Civil War ended, and the Southern slaves kept their right to be free. The Emancipation Proclamation led to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which ended slavery in all of the United States. Question 77. What did Susan B. Anthony do? Fought for women's rights, fought for civil rights. Susan B. Anthony was born in Massachusetts on February 15, 1820. She is known for campaigning for the right of women to vote. She spoke out publicly against slavery and for equal treatment of women in the workplace. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution gave women the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony died 14 years before the adoption of the 19th Amendment, but it was still widely known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. In 1979, she became the first woman whose image appeared on a circulating U.S. coin. The coin is called the Susan B. Anthony dollar and is worth $1. Part C. Recent American History and Other Important Historical Information. Question 78. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1900s. World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Persian Gulf War. The United States fought 5 wars in the 1900s. World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Persian Gulf War. World War I began in 1914. It was a long and bloody struggle. The United States entered the war in 1917 after German submarines attacked British and U.S. ships, and the Germans contacted Mexico about starting a war against the United States. The war ended in 1918 when the Allied powers, led by Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, defeated the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The Treaty of Versailles officially ended the war in 1919. World War I was called the War to End All Wars. World War II began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. France and Great Britain then declared war on Germany. Germany had alliances with Italy and Japan, and together they formed the Axis powers. The United States entered World War II in 1941 after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The United States joined France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union as the Allied powers and led the 1944 invasion of France, known as D-Day. The liberation of Europe from German power was completed by May 1945. World War II did not end until Japan surrendered in September 1945. The Korean War began in 1950 when the North Korean Army moved across the 38th parallel into South Korea. The 38th parallel was a boundary established after World War II. This boundary separated the northern area of Korea, which was under communist influence, from the southern area of Korea, which was allied with the United States. At the time, the United States was providing support to establish a democratic South Korean government. The United States provided military support to stop the advance of the North Korean Army. In the Korean conflict, democratic governments directly confronted communist governments. The fighting ended in 1953 with the establishment of the countries of North Korea and South Korea. From 1959 to 1975, United States Armed Forces and the South Vietnamese Army fought against the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. The United States supported the democratic government in the south of the country to help it resist pressure from the communist North. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. In 1976, Vietnam was under total communist control. Almost 60,000 American men and women in the military died or were missing as a result of the Vietnam War. On August 2, 1990, the Persian Gulf War began when Iraq invaded Kuwait. This invasion put the Iraqi army closer to Saudi Arabia and its oil reserves, which supplied much of the world with oil. The United States and many other countries wanted to drive the Iraqi army out of Kuwait and prevent it from invading other nearby countries. In January 1991, the United States led an international coalition of forces authorized by the United Nations into battle against the Iraqi army. Within a month, the coalition had driven the Iraqis from Kuwait. The coalition declared a ceasefire on February 28, 1991. Question 79. Who was president during World War I? Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States. President Wilson served 2 terms from 1913 to 1921. During his first term, he was able to keep the United States out of World War I. By 1917, Wilson knew this was no longer possible, and he asked Congress to declare war on Germany. On January 8, 1918, he made a speech to Congress outlining 14 points that justified the war and called for a plan to maintain peace after the war. President Wilson said, We entered this war because violations of right had occurred which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible unless they were corrected and the world secure once for all against their recurrence. The war ended that year, and Wilson traveled to Paris to work out the details of the surrender by Germany. Question 80. Who was the president during the Great Depression and World War II? Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, was President of the United States from 1933 until 1945. He was elected during the Great Depression, which was a period of economic crisis after the stock market crash of 1929. His program for handling the crisis was called the New Deal. It included programs to create jobs and provided benefits and financial security for workers across the country. Under his leadership, the Social Security Administration, SSA, was established in 1935. Roosevelt led the nation into World War II after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. He gave the country a sense of hope and strength during a time of great struggle. Roosevelt was elected to office 4 times. He died in 1945, early in his 4th term as president. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a human rights leader throughout her lifetime. Question 81. Who did the United States fight in World War II? Japan, Germany, and Italy. The Japanese bombed U.S. naval bases in a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, as Commander-in-Chief of the military, obtained an official declaration of war from Congress. Japan's partners in the Axis, Italy, and Germany, then declared war on the United States. The Allies fought against the German Nazis, the Italian fascists, and Japan's military empire. This was truly a world war, with battles fought in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. Question 82. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? World War II. Before becoming the 34th President of the United States in 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower served as a Major General in World War II. As commander of U.S. forces and supreme commander of the Allies in Europe, he led the successful D-Day invasion of Normandy, France, on June 6, 1944. In 1952, he retired from active service in the military. He was elected President of the United States later that year. As President, he established the interstate highway system, and in 1953, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, now known as Health and Human Services, was created. He oversaw the end of the Korean War. Eisenhower left the White House in 1961 after serving 2 terms as president. Question 83. During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? Communism. The main concern of the United States during the Cold War was the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, was a powerful nation that operated under the principles of communism. The United States and its allies believed that a democratic government and a capitalist economy were the best ways to preserve individual rights and freedoms. The United States and its allies feared the expansion of communism to countries outside the Soviet Union. The Cold War began shortly after the end of World War II and lasted for more than 40 years. It ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the reunification of East and West Germany in 1990 and the breakup of the USSR in 1991. Question 84. What movement tried to end racial discrimination? Civil Rights Movement. The modern civil rights movement in the United States began in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The goal of the civil rights movement was to end racial discrimination against African Americans and to gain full and equal rights for Americans of all races. Using nonviolent strategies such as bus boycotts, sit-ins, and marches, people came together to demand social change. As a result, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act made segregation in public facilities and racial discrimination in employment and education illegal. The law protects African Americans, women, and others from discrimination. The Voting Rights Act banned literacy tests and other special requirements that had been used to stop African Americans from registering to vote. Question 85. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? Fought for civil rights, worked for equality for all Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and civil rights leader. He worked hard to make America a more fair, tolerant, and equal nation. He was the main leader of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Because of this movement, civil rights laws were passed to protect voting rights and end racial segregation. King believed in the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, that every citizen deserves America's promise of equality and justice. In 1963, King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which imagines an America in which people of all races exist together equally. He was only 35 years old when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his civil rights work. King was killed on April 4, 1968.